This owl landed on a woman's window every day until she understood the message. The first time the owl landed on the window, Margaret Ellis thought it was only seeking shelter from the wind. It was late November in the little mountain town of Silver Hollow, and the first real snow of the season had arrived before dawn, covering roofs, roads, and pine branches in a soft white silence. Margaret had been standing in her upstairs sewing room with a cup of tea warming her hands, watching the snow drift across the backyard, when a shadow swept past the glass. Then came the sound, a soft thud, not hard enough to crack the window, but close enough to make her step back. A large barn owl had landed on the narrow outside sill. Margaret stared. The owl was beautiful in the strange, ghostly way barn owls are beautiful. Its heart-shaped face was pale as moonlight, framed by soft golden feathers dusted with snow. Its dark eyes seemed impossibly deep, fixed directly on Margaret through the glass. One wing hung slightly lower than the other, though not enough to look broken. Its talons gripped the frozen sill and its feathers lifted in the wind. Margaret did not move. The owl did not move either. For nearly a full minute they simply looked at one another, a 68-year-old widow in a faded blue sweater and a wild bird perched outside her window as if it had chosen her house deliberately. Then the owl turned its head toward the woods behind the property. It looked back at Margaret, then toward the woods again. Margaret gave a quiet laugh, mostly because the moment felt too odd to take seriously. "Well," she said through the glass, "good morning to you too." The owl blinked once. Then it lifted silently into the snowy air and disappeared between the trees. Margaret stood there long after it was gone. Her house sat at the edge of Silver Hollow, where the last row of homes gave way to National Forest. She had lived there for 41 years, first with her husband Thomas, then alone after his death 5 winters earlier. Thomas had been the town's only veterinarian for most of his life, and their home had never been a quiet one when he was alive. Injured dogs in the mudroom, orphaned kittens in boxes beside the stove, a hawk recovering in the garage once, despite Margaret's firm rule that no raptors belonged anywhere near her laundry shelves. After Thomas died, the house became too quiet. Margaret filled the silence with sewing, bird feeders, library books, and phone calls from her daughter Claire, who lived 2 hours away and worried too much. She had told Claire many times that she was fine. The truth was more complicated. She was safe. She was capable. She had friends in town and neighbors who waved. But some evenings, when the forest darkened and the old house settled around her, the quiet felt less like peace and more like being forgotten. So when the owl returned the next morning, Margaret was waiting. She would not admit that to anyone. But she had placed her tea on the sewing table and pulled the curtain open just before 8. At 8:12, the owl came. It landed on the same sill, same silent sweep, same pale face, same dark eyes. Margaret's breath caught. "You again," she whispered. The owl stood outside the glass, snowflakes melting against its feathers. This time Margaret noticed more details. Its left foot seemed clenched strangely, as if something irritated it. One side of its chest feathers looked ruffled, but it was alert, steady, and entirely focused. Again it turned toward the woods. Again it looked back at her. Margaret frowned. "What are you looking at?" The owl made no sound. It simply stared. Then it lifted away and vanished behind the pines. On the third morning, Margaret called her neighbor, Daniel Price. Daniel lived in the next house down the hill and worked as a history teacher at the high school. He was 43, divorced, kind in a reserved way, and often helped Margaret shovel the front path before she could protest. He arrived that morning wearing a thick coat over his work clothes, holding a travel mug of coffee. "So," he said, stepping into her kitchen, "Claire says you're being visited by a mysterious owl." Margaret sighed. "I should not have told my daughter." "Probably not. She called me before 7. "Of course she did." Daniel smiled. "She worries because she loves you." "She worries because she thinks I'm one loose rug away from disaster." "Also possible." Margaret gave him a look, but there was no real irritation behind it. They went upstairs to the sewing room and waited by the window. Margaret felt slightly foolish now. The owl would not come, she was sure of it. Wild creatures never performed on schedule simply because humans had witnesses. Then at 8:14, the owl landed on the sill. Daniel's smile vanished. "Oh," he said softly. The owl looked through the window at Margaret first, then at Daniel, then toward the woods. Daniel stepped closer, careful not to tap the glass. "That's unusual." "I told you." "You did. I thought maybe it had bumped the window once and you made a story out of it." "I am old, Daniel, not dramatic." He glanced at her. "Well, not always dramatic." The owl shifted on the sill. This time it lifted its left foot briefly. Daniel leaned forward. "There's something on its leg." Margaret's heart tightened. "What?" "I can't tell. Maybe string, fishing line, something caught around the talon." The owl turned toward the woods again, then back. Margaret suddenly felt cold. "It keeps doing that," she said. "Looking at the woods?" "Yes, like it wants me to notice something." Daniel was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I'll call wildlife rescue." The owl flew away before anyone could take a proper photo. The nearest wildlife rehabilitation center was 45 minutes away, run by a woman named Ruth Hanley who sounded both compassionate and overworked on the phone. Daniel explained the situation while Margaret stood beside him, arms folded tightly. "A barn owl landing on the same window every morning?" Ruth asked. "3 mornings in a row." "Any visible injury?" "Possible entanglement on one foot, maybe wing strain." "Is it trying to enter the house?" "No." "Is there food near the window?" "No." Ruth went quiet. Margaret could hear papers shifting in the background. "Barn owls are usually nocturnal," Ruth said. "Seeing one active in daylight repeatedly can indicate stress, hunger, injury, or disturbance near its roost. If it's entangled, we may need to capture it, but if it's still flying, that can be difficult." Margaret stepped closer to the phone. "It keeps looking toward the woods." Ruth paused again. "Do you have old buildings nearby? Barns, sheds, abandoned cabins?" Margaret looked toward the window. "There's an old ranger cabin through the trees," she said. "About half a mile back. No one uses it anymore." "Any recent storms?" "Windstorm last week. Heavy snow now." Ruth's voice changed slightly. "It may have a nest or mate in that area. Barn owls don't usually nest this late, but they can use old structures for shelter. If it's repeatedly coming to your window and looking that direction, something may have disturbed its roost." Daniel looked at Margaret. Margaret looked at the woods. Ruth continued, "I can come by this afternoon to check the property, but do not follow the owl alone. Do not attempt to catch it. And if you find a roost, keep your distance," Margaret promised. Then she spent the next 3 hours staring out the window. Ruth arrived just after lunch in a white van with the words Mountain Valley Wildlife Rescue printed on the side. She was in her mid-50s, short and sturdy, with silver hair tucked under a wool hat and the sharp, watchful eyes of someone who had handled more frightened animals than frightened people. She carried binoculars, gloves, a carrier, and a calm authority that Margaret immediately trusted. "Show me the window," Ruth said. Margaret led her upstairs. Ruth examined the outside sill from inside, then went into the yard and checked the ground below. Snow preserved everything. Tiny marks showed where the owl's talons had touched the sill. Beneath the window, Ruth found a few pale feathers and something thin caught on the edge of a rosebush. She lifted it carefully. Fishing line. Margaret felt her stomach sink. Ruth's face hardened. "That may be what's caught on the owl." Daniel, who had come over again after school, frowned. "There's no fishing pond up here." "People use line for all sorts of things," Ruth said. "Hanging decorations, tying tarps, it travels. Birds get caught in the smallest trash." Margaret looked toward the woods. "Can we check the ranger cabin?" Ruth considered the snow, the fading light, and the thick trees beyond the yard. "We can check the path," she said. "But carefully. If the owl appears, we stop and observe. No chasing." Margaret reached for her boots. Ruth looked at her. I meant Daniel and me. Margaret stiffened. This is my property line. And you're not hiking through snowy woods at dusk. I have lived beside these woods longer than either of you. Daniel coughed. That is true. Ruth gave him a look. Margaret lifted her chin. I'm coming. In the end, Ruth allowed it only because the old ranger trail began behind Margaret's garden and was mostly flat for the first quarter mile. Daniel walked beside Margaret with the protective tension of a man preparing to catch someone who had no intention of falling. Ruth led the way, following faint animal tracks and the narrow line of the old path through the pines. The forest was quiet in the snow, too quiet. Their boots crunched softly. Branches dipped beneath white weight. Far above, a raven called once and then fell silent. Margaret had walked this trail hundreds of times with Thomas years ago. They used to check for injured wildlife after storms, especially near the ranger cabin where broken windows and loose boards sometimes trapped birds or squirrels. She had not walked it since he died. The realization came slowly, then painfully. She stopped for half a second. Daniel noticed. You okay? Yes, she said too quickly, but her voice was softer after that. They reached the first bend in the trail when a shadow passed above them. Ruth raised one hand. The owl landed on a low pine branch ahead. Margaret's heart hammered. There it was, the same pale face, the same dark eyes. In daylight, away from the window, it looked more fragile. The fishing line was visible now, wrapped around one leg and trailing from its talons. Every time the owl shifted, the line pulled against its foot. Oh, poor thing, Margaret whispered. The owl looked at her. Then it turned deeper into the woods. It flew a short distance, low and uneven, and landed again. Ruth exhaled slowly. It's leading us towards something. Daniel said nothing. Margaret did not say, I told you. She didn't need to. They followed at a careful distance. The owl moved from tree to tree, never far ahead, never too close. Its flight was labored but deliberate. Twice it stopped and waited when the humans fell behind. Ruth grew more alert with every minute. This is not normal behavior, she said quietly. Something is very wrong. The old ranger cabin appeared through the trees just as the winter light began to fade. It was smaller than Margaret remembered, a weathered wooden structure with a sagging porch, boarded windows, and a roof patched with rusted metal sheets. Snow covered the steps. One side of the roof had been damaged by the recent windstorm, leaving a gap near the upper loft. The owl landed on a broken beam near the roof line. Then from inside the cabin came a sound, a faint screech. Margaret grabbed Daniel's arm. Ruth went completely still. The sound came again, not from the owl outside, from inside. Ruth lifted her binoculars toward the roof gap. There's another owl in there. The owl on the beam gave a soft rasping call. From inside came a weaker answer. Margaret felt tears sting her eyes. Is it trapped? She whispered. Ruth was already moving toward the cabin, slowly and cautiously. Possibly. Stay back. The door was swollen shut from moisture. Daniel had to push hard to open it. It gave way with a groan, releasing the smell of old wood, dust, damp insulation, and animal droppings. Ruth entered first with a flashlight. Daniel followed. Margaret stayed near the doorway despite wanting to rush in. Inside, the cabin was dim and cold. A broken table leaned against one wall. Leaves had blown across the floor. Snow drifted through holes in the roof. In the far corner beneath the loft, a pile of old fishing line, plastic twine, and torn tarp strips hung from a collapsed shelf. Ruth shone her light upward. There, she said. A second barn owl hung partly upside down from the loft beams. Margaret gasped. The owl was caught badly. Fishing line and twine had wrapped around one wing and both feet, suspending it awkwardly against a beam. It had clearly struggled, tightening the line more. Its feathers were disheveled and one wing hung at a terrible angle. It was alive but weak. Near it, on a ledge of old rafters, something moved. Small, pale, fluffy. Daniel whispered, "Are those babies?" Ruth's face changed. "Not babies," she said after a moment. "Juveniles, young owls." There were 3 of them huddled in the shadows of the loft, old enough to have feathers but not strong enough to survive alone for long. They stared down with wide dark eyes, silent and frightened. Margaret understood then. The owl at her window was not asking for help for itself. It had been trying to lead her to its trapped mate and to their young. Ruth moved quickly but carefully. "Daniel, I need the carrier and the heavy gloves. Margaret, stay at the door and keep watch for the free owl." Margaret looked outside. The owl with the fishing line around its leg remained on the roof beam, watching. Its mate gave a weak screech from inside. The free owl shifted but did not fly away. It stayed. The rescue was difficult. The trapped owl was frightened, tangled, and weak, and the loft beams were unstable. Daniel held the ladder while Ruth climbed high enough to reach the bird. Every movement had to be slow. If the owl panicked and broke a wing further, it might never fly again. If Ruth cut the wrong strand first, the bird could fall. Margaret stood in the doorway, hands clenched, whispering prayers she had not said since Thomas died. The free owl watched from above. Snow began to fall again. Ruth cut the first line. The trapped owl struggled weakly. "Easy," Ruth murmured. I know. Daniel looked up. "Need me to climb?" "No, hold the ladder." The second line came loose, then the third. Finally, Ruth wrapped the owl securely in a towel and freed the last loop from its feet. The bird collapsed against her hands, exhausted but alive. "Got her," Ruth said. Margaret let out a breath that became a sob. The juveniles rustled in the loft. Ruth climbed down with the trapped owl bundled against her chest. "She needs care immediately. Wing injury, dehydration, possible circulation damage to the feet." "What about the young ones?" Daniel asked. "I need to assess them. If they're old enough and healthy enough, we may leave them with the male temporarily, but with the mother injured and the roost unsafe, we may need to take all of them." Margaret looked at the owl outside. "The male?" "Likely," Ruth said. "He's been trying to get help." The male owl gave a soft call from the roof. The juveniles answered. That sound broke something open inside Margaret. For days, this wild bird had come to her window. Not once, not randomly. Every morning, he had looked through the glass at an old woman alone in an old house and somehow decided she was the best chance his family had. Ruth examined the juveniles from the loft as best she could. They were thin, too thin. The male had likely been trying to feed them alone while entangled himself, with the female trapped and unable to hunt. The storm had damaged the roof, exposed the roost, and caught the female in old line left inside the cabin by someone careless years before. "They all need to come in," Ruth said finally. "The roost isn't safe and the male has line on his leg. We need to capture him too if we can." Margaret looked at the owl on the roof. "How?" Ruth's expression was serious, with patience and luck. But the male owl surprised them all. When Ruth carried the trapped female outside in the towel, the male flew down from the beam to a low stump near the path. He stared at the bundle in Ruth's arms, his injured foot curled awkwardly around the wood, fishing line trailing from it. Ruth slowly lowered herself to one knee. The male did not fly. Margaret barely breathed. Ruth placed the female owl carefully inside a ventilated carrier. The male watched every movement. Then Ruth took a soft net and moved with extraordinary slowness. The owl could have flown. Even injured, he could have vanished into the trees. Instead, he stayed focused on the carrier, on his mate. Ruth lowered the net. The owl flapped once, but weakly. Then she had him. "Got him," Daniel whispered, as if speaking louder might undo it. Ruth quickly secured the male and began cutting away the visible fishing line from his leg. It had tightened around 2 talons, causing swelling but not yet permanent damage. "He's lucky," she said. "Another day or 2 and he might have lost the foot." Margaret looked toward the cabin. "And the young?" Daniel helped Ruth bring the juveniles down one at a time. They hissed and clicked their beaks, trying to look terrifying while trembling in gloved hands. Margaret found them heartbreakingly beautiful, wild little ghosts with soft feathers and fierce eyes. By full dark, all 5 owls were in carriers in Ruth's van. The rescue center became the center of Margaret's life for the next several weeks. At first, Ruth warned her not to hope too much. The female owl's wing injury was serious. The line had cut into the skin and strained the joint. Infection was possible. The juveniles were underweight. The male's foot needed treatment and monitoring. But the family had a chance. Margaret called every morning. Ruth began answering with, "Good morning, Margaret. Yes, they're still alive," before Margaret even asked. The female was named Willow for medical records. The male, because of his stubborn window visits, was named Harold by one of the volunteers. Margaret thought that was ridiculous and perfect. The juveniles were called Birch, Clover, and Ash. Ruth sent photos occasionally. Willow wrapped safely during treatment. Harold perched in a recovery enclosure with one foot bandaged. The young owls lined up like disapproving judges. Margaret printed each photo and pinned it in her sewing room beside the window, the same window where Harold had landed. Something changed in Margaret during those weeks. At first, she told herself she was only invested because the owls had come to her, but it was more than that. The rescue pulled her back into parts of herself she had let go quiet after Thomas died. She remembered the rhythm of care, the urgency, the tenderness that required action instead of memory. She began volunteering at the Wildlife Center on Tuesdays. Nothing dramatic: laundry, dishes, cutting fruit for songbirds, logging donated supplies. She was not allowed near dangerous animals without training, and Ruth made that very clear. But she learned quickly, listened carefully, and discovered that useful work could soften grief in a way sympathy never had. Daniel drove her the first few times until she insisted she was perfectly capable of driving herself. Claire, her daughter, cried when Margaret told her, "Mom, that's wonderful." "I'm folding towels, Claire. Don't make it sound heroic." "It is heroic if you've been avoiding leaving the house for months." Margaret was silent. Claire softened. "I'm proud of you." Margaret looked out the sewing room window toward the woods. "So is your father, I imagine," she said quietly. By late winter, the owl family had improved. Harold's foot healed first. He was test-flown in the center's large aviary and moved with silent strength, as if offended anyone had doubted him. The juveniles gained weight and learned to hunt live prey in controlled conditions. Willow took longer. For weeks, the question of release remained uncertain. If she could not fly well enough to hunt, she could not survive in the wild. Margaret attended one of Willow's flight tests from behind an observation screen. Ruth stood beside her. Willow perched at one end of the aviary, pale face alert. For a moment, she simply stared into the open space. Then she flew. Not perfectly, not effortlessly, but she flew. Across the aviary, silent as falling snow, wings wide and steady. Margaret pressed both hands to her mouth. Ruth smiled. "That's a good flight." "Good enough?" "Maybe. We'll keep building strength." 3 weeks later, Ruth called Margaret with the news. "They're ready." The release was set for early March, on a clear evening when the snow had begun to melt and the first dark patches of earth appeared beneath the pines. They chose a protected area of forest not far from the old ranger cabin but away from the unsafe structure. Volunteers had installed a proper owl nesting box high in a pine in case the family chose to use it. The old cabin had been cleaned of dangerous line and debris by Forest Service workers after Ruth reported it. Margaret arrived with Daniel, Claire, and Claire's teenage son Milo, who had driven up for the occasion. She wore Thomas's old wool scarf and carried a thermos of tea no one drank. The carriers were placed at the edge of a small clearing. Dusk gathered slowly. Ruth opened Harold's carrier first. For a few seconds, nothing happened. Then the male barn owl stepped into the open. He looked smaller on the ground than he had at Margaret's window, but no less extraordinary. He lifted his pale face toward the darkening trees, spread his wings, and rose silently into the air. He landed on a low branch and looked back. Willow came next. She hesitated longer. Margaret held her breath. Then Willow launched. Her wings caught the evening air. She climbed toward Harold's branch, landed beside him, and steadied herself. Ruth released the juveniles one by one. Birch flew immediately and clumsily bumped into a branch before recovering. Clover circled low, then rose. Ash hesitated until Willow gave a soft call from above. Then the last young owl lifted into the dusk. For a moment, all 5 owls were visible in the trees, 5 pale shapes in the fading light. A family restored to the forest. Margaret felt tears slide down her face. Harold turned his head. His dark eyes seemed to find her. Perhaps he recognized her. Perhaps he recognized the shape of a human near the window where help had once appeared. Perhaps he saw nothing but movement in the clearing. Margaret did not need to know. He had survived. His mate had survived. Their young had survived. That was enough. The owls lifted one by one into the deeper woods, silent, wild, free. Spring came slowly to Silver Hollow. Margaret kept volunteering. She walked the old ranger trail again, first with Daniel, then alone when the snow melted. The cabin was eventually boarded properly and warning signs were posted. Local schools organized cleanup days to remove fishing line, twine, plastic netting, and other hazards from trails and streams. Ruth asked Margaret to speak at one community event about what had happened. Margaret refused at first, then she agreed. Standing in the town library meeting room, facing neighbors, children, hikers, and forest workers, she told the story without embellishing it too much. She did not claim the owl spoke to her. She did not pretend wild animals were magical messengers. She explained the danger of discarded line. She explained that injured wildlife should be handled only by trained rescuers. She explained how easily a family of owls had nearly died because of human carelessness. But at the end, she paused. Then she said, "For 3 mornings, that owl came to my window and looked toward the woods. I don't know what he understood. I don't know why he chose my window, but I know this. He kept coming back until someone paid attention. Sometimes paying attention is the beginning of rescue." People remembered that, children especially. They began calling fishing line silent traps and reminded adults to clean up after themselves on trails. The Wildlife Center received more donations than usual that spring. Volunteers increased. Margaret found herself surrounded by people again in ways she had not expected. And sometimes on quiet mornings she still waited by the sewing room window. Not because she wanted Harold to return. She hoped he did not need to. But she liked watching the woods now. She liked knowing she was still part of the world beyond the glass. One evening in early summer, just after sunset, Margaret was sewing a quilt from old fabric scraps when a shadow crossed the window. She looked up. A barn owl landed on the sill. For one impossible second, her heart stopped. The owl was pale and still, with a familiar way of tilting its head. Its feet looked healthy, its wings folded neatly, no line, no injury. Margaret stood slowly. "Harold?" she whispered. The owl blinked. Behind him in the trees, another pale shape moved. Then 3 smaller shapes swept between the branches, silent and quick in the dusk. Margaret began to smile through tears. The owl on the sill did not tap the glass, did not stare desperately toward the woods, did not ask anything of her. He simply stayed for a moment. Then he turned and flew back toward his family. Margaret watched until the last pale wing vanished into the dark. When Claire called that night, Margaret told her what had happened. "Mom," Claire said softly, "do you think he came back to thank you?" Margaret looked at Thomas's scarf folded over the chair, at the owl photos still pinned beside the window, at the sewing room that no longer felt like a place to hide from the world but a place to look out at it. "I don't know," she said. Then she smiled. "But I think he knew the house." Years later, Margaret would still tell the story to new volunteers at the Wildlife Center. She told them about the owl at the window, the line around his foot, the trapped mate in the ranger cabin, and the three young owls hidden in the rafters. She told them how rescue was not about sentiment alone, but about patience, training, and doing the right thing carefully. She told them never to handle wildlife without help, never to assume, never to ignore repeated unusual behavior, and she always ended with the same lesson. The owl did not speak in words, she would say, but he had a message. He showed up. He waited. He looked where help was needed. It took me 3 days to understand, but finally I listened. Then she would look out toward the aviary, where recovering birds tested their wings against the air. Sometimes the world is asking for help very quietly. Sometimes it lands on your window in the snow. And sometimes, if you are willing to look past your own loneliness, you find a whole family waiting to be saved. So before we go, remember this. Not every message comes as a voice. Some messages arrive as a shadow at the glass, a pair of dark eyes, a wild creature returning again and again to the same place with urgent silence. The owl at Margaret's window was not lost. He was not begging for food. He was guiding her toward the forest, toward a trapped mate, toward 3 young lives hidden in the cold. And when she finally understood, she did more than save a family of owls. She found her way back to the living world.